Hello and welcome to this meeting on understanding US policy in Somalia. My name is Ahmed Soliman and I'm a research fellow with the Africa program at Chatham House. We're delighted today to be hosting this event and also to be launching our latest Africa program research paper on the very same topic, understanding US policy in Somalia, by Professor Paul Williams. And we're delighted that he will join us today to discuss the paper, along with an esteemed panel of speakers, including Abdi Ainti, the former Minister of Planning and International Cooperation of Somalia and co-founder of the Heritage Institute for Policy Studies, and also Susan Stigant, the Director of Africa Programs at USIP. The meeting today, the panel are going to discuss the evolution of US strategy on Somalia and how potential shifts could influence future scenarios in Somalia, with implications, of course, for federalism and resolution of the conflict with al-Shabaab. We have a few house points before we get started that I'd like to inform you of. All the attendees today are going to be muted during our presentations, but you will be able to use the raise hand function during the Q&A session in order to ask a question live. And we would very much encourage you to use this method for asking questions. Please use the raise hand function. If you're selected, you'll be granted permission by the Africa program to unmute and ask your question. So please do introduce yourself and ask your question then. But apologies in advance if you're not able to ask your question this time. I think we have over 200 people on the line at the moment for this meeting. Zoom participants can also submit written questions through the Q&A box throughout the meeting. But again, we want to emphasize that we would prefer you to use the raise hand function during the Q&A session so that you can ask your questions directly and we have a more interactive experience. Unfortunately, we're unable to take questions from participants joining us through Facebook Live at this time, so please do accept our apologies for that. A few other housekeeping points. This meeting is on the record. That means that anyone present can use information from the meeting and identify our speakers or participants. Also, filming and recording of this event are not allowed without prior permission from Chatham House. However, we would encourage everyone to tweet the event using the hashtag #CHAfrica. So before we get started, I'll read out the biographies of our speakers. Professor Paul Williams is a professor in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, where he also manages the MA program in Security Policy Studies. He worked previously at the universities of Aberystwyth, Birmingham and Warwick in the UK, and has held visiting positions in the International Peace Institute, the Woodrow Wilson Centre for International Scholars, and the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University. His most recent book is Fighting for Peace in Somalia, a history and analysis of the African Union mission in Somalia. Abdi Ainti is a former Minister of Planning and International Cooperation of Somalia. In that capacity, he was responsible for engaging Somalia's international partners on development and official assistance matters. He's also the co-founder and former executive director of HIPS, a leading think tank based in Mogadishu, where he currently sits on the board of directors. Prior to that, Mr. Ainti was a journalist and editor for 12 years with the BBC, Voice of America, and Al Jazeera English. Susan Stigant is the director of the Africa programs at USIP, where she provides strategic leadership for programming in Nigeria, the Greater Horn of Africa, the Red Sea, Central African Republic, and on the African Union. Susan's thematic focus is on the design and implementation of inclusive constitutional reform and national dialogue processes. She has advised government officials, civic leaders and peace builders on power sharing agreements, elections in Sudan, South Sudan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen and elsewhere. Prior to joining USIP, Susan managed constitutional development, citizen engagement and election observation programs with NDI, the National Democratic Institute. She also worked with the Forum of Federations on Comparative Federalism and with the research unit of Western Cape Provincial Parliament in South Africa. So we'll start our presentations now, and I'll turn to Paul Williams, who will talk for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have our discussants come in for 8 minutes or so each. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and thanks for the kind introduction, and thank you to all of the Chatham House team for organising this event. I'm just going to share a few slides with the audience as I talk through, and what I'd like to do with my time is just try and give you a sense, first of all, of why I wrote this report now, and just give you an overview of what are the main sort of points and arguments in it. I suppose the first reason that I was sort of motivated to do this was that the media debate about US policy in Somalia, I think, was very intermittent. And when the media did focus on what the US was doing in Somalia, it's tended to focus either on very sort of tactical and quite myopic issues, the number of airstrikes involved, when US personnel in particular had been attacked. And as a result, I felt it was only giving part of the picture of what was happening here. So the second reason is that I wanted to write a document that could try and give people a bit more of a sort of comprehensive and big picture view of what the United States has been doing. And obviously there, it's been part of now a 14-year-long war against al-Shabaab that's been fought by this international coalition of actors involved. And so here, I think, rather than a debate just about airstrikes and numbers going up or down, there's actually been a lot more continuity, I would say a real significant degree of continuity in US policy towards Somalia over at least 3 administrations now. But my motivation here was then asking the question about how would it end, right? What would it take for US military engagement in particular in Somalia to actually come to an end? What's the sort of threshold of risk and vulnerability and level of stability that would require to do that? And are we going to be facing, in effect, another sort of forever war in Somalia? Or is there some way to overcome the stalemate that I think we're facing at the moment? And then finally, the third motivating factor was to do with this is an important year in terms of electoral processes, obviously in both the United States and Somalia. Obviously, we're not exactly sure in what format or when the Somali electoral processes will take place. But of course, debating these types of issues now, I think, is really important, because maybe after those electoral processes have played out, there may be an opportunity to really have serious discussions about potentially changing the direction of US policy. So what I then, with those sort of ideas in mind, what I tried to do in the report was the following 4 things. I really tried to give a sense and answer 4 main questions. First of all, what exactly was the US mission in Somalia? What is US policy trying to achieve? And here you'll find there's a range of, obviously, a sort of quite long list of objectives. But for me, if you go back since the late 1990s, when the US embassies were attacked in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, the real thread, if you like, of continuity and the sort of primary focus of the US mission in Somalia has revolved to a large extent around counterterrorism. And that's sort of been the reason why we've seen a lot of the manifestations that we have. But of course, in order to do effective counterterrorism, most US administrations now have decided that that's going to be only possible if it goes along with effective state building and trying to build up the institutions across particularly the security sector, but others as well of the Somali state. And that leads then to the second question that I address in the report, which is about how has the United States government and different administrations tried to implement these objectives. And here I give a quick summary basically of the different political forms of support that the US has engaged politically with, obviously, a transitional federal government, the permanent federal government, the authorities up in Somaliland and different regional administrations around the country. I then spend probably most time focusing on the military ways that the United States has been acting. And here I quickly summarized, the military support that the United States has given to the African Union mission and its troop contributing countries. how the US has supported various Somali securities forces, and then also how the US has conducted its own, often kinetic military operations, including special forces operations and airstrikes and the like. Increasingly, those have been in tandem with various Somali forces as well. And then, to a lesser extent of my focus here, I also summarize what the US has been doing in terms of humanitarian aid and economic assistance. Now, obviously, key here is the debate about debt relief for Somalia and the US role in that. And then that leads to the third question, where I try and give an assessment of whether or not US policies have been working effectively in Somalia. And I think the simplest way to summarize this is to say it's been a huge source of contention. There's really a significant range of opinion within the United States and beyond about whether the United States policies have been effective or failing. Just to very quickly summarize that as I would sort of see it in the paper. On the one hand, you've got the sort of, I would say, supporters and defenders of US policies, and they make a relatively sort of muted case, I would say. Their argument is generally that the US policies have made a pretty terrible situation a bit better. US policies have helped sort of with damage limitation and the containment and degrading of al-Shabaab. Certainly if you look back to sort of 2009 or so, when al-Shabaab was a really sort of existential threat to the transitional federal government in Mogadishu. And in that sense, you'll see the language that's used is that Somalia in US lexicon has sort of moved from being a failed state to a fragile state, and that US policies are partly responsible for that progress. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the sort of more critics of US policies here would see a very different state of affairs. Here, for them, the United States policies have ultimately been counterproductive. Not just the way US is engaged militarily, but also politically. And that actually US policies in the region have been a boon in recruiting for al-Shabaab. They've actually now crossed the line in terms of being counterproductive if we think of things like civilian casualties from airstrikes and some of the sort of less transparent workings of this policy. And so that's why I think ultimately the debate is still raging about that. And then finally, I look to the future and say in the report, you know, what, again, at big picture level, how can we think about potential US options? Can we just carry on as we've been acting before, or are there other alternatives available? And here I just briefly sketch out three broad options that the United States might think about adopting. I'll say more about these in a minute, but in effect, we can keep the business as usual status quo. Secondly, we might think about negotiated settlements as a way to end this war, and how the United States might support a negotiated settlement or two. And thirdly, we might think about actual disengagement, a sort of hopefully constructive form of disengagement whereby the US winds down its sort of military and kinetic activities and engages more politically and in humanitarian terms. So that's an overview of the report, and hopefully it will give people a sense of that sort of overall big picture of US policy. I'd now just like to briefly sort of give you my own arguments that appear in the report. So first of all, my assessment of how this conflict is playing out. Now for me, I think the United States has got real but limited national security interests in stabilizing Somalia. It's important to remember this is not a top tier #1 priority for the United States. I would say this goes back for really a couple of decades, but certainly now in the era of sort of strategic competition and great power competition that the US national defense strategy is focused on, Africa in general and Somalia in particular is a serious security concern, but it's not sort of top tier. As everyone probably already knows, since 2006, al-Shabaab has been the principal opponent of the United States in trying to implement this policy, albeit the Islamic State has, you know, appeared in different guises in various years. And as I argued at the beginning, successive administrations have actually used roughly the same political and military tools to achieve these objectives. Yes, the numbers of airstrikes have fluctuated, but the broad strategy to contain and degrade al-Shabaab has remained pretty consistent. The problem, I think, and this is my assessment of sort of the military terrain at the moment, is that these policies have delivered in a military dimension. Sometimes they've delivered operational and tactical successes, but they haven't altered the strategic terrain of the war against al-Shabaab. And in my opinion and assessment, the war against al-Shabaab has now become one of a war of attrition. I would argue that especially since, or at least since 2016, when the last of the major AMISOM offensive operations ended, we've been in effect at a military stalemate in this war. And as a result of that, I don't see on current evidence any likelihood of either side achieving a decisive military victory. And so that's how I assess the situation. Where does my analysis take me? This is where I come to the sort of three broad options. Given that military stalemate, I think the United States is faced with three plausible sort of strategic choices here. On the one hand, it can continue with the business as usual, the sort of status quo, and continue muddling through. The problem here, I think, is that this status quo is actually quite costly for the Somali authorities and the international coalition that supports AMISOM to maintain. We're maintaining about nearly 20,000 peacekeeping troops. They cost money in terms of allowances, logistics support, mission support, and other things. They're spread across and dispersed across south-central Somalia in a wide range of, quite small, many of them, forward operating bases. They require aviation assets to fly logistical support out to them. So for all these reasons, maintaining the status quo is quite a costly endeavour for the Somali authorities and international coalition. And we must remember it's quite plausible or possible that that international coalition that's supporting AMISOM may start to wane, either for financial or political reasons. But that's what scenario one would look like, more of the same with a sort of uncertain endpoint. The second option would be to support a negotiated settlement to end this war. Now, clearly, neither side wants this at the moment, but in my estimation, it's the most plausible way to actually bring this war to an end, given that I don't see decisive military victory as being on the cards. And I'll say a little bit more about that finally. And then the third option would be for the United States to broadly start disengaging, certainly militarily, from Somalia, and then we could debate the more political, humanitarian, and economic dimensions. This, of course, would sort of appease the critics of US policy that already see it as counterproductive. It would certainly save the United States money and military personnel and effort, but of course it would come at a major cost. There are major sunk costs in that we've been trying to engage for over 15 years or so in this way, and what would it mean to sort of walk away? And there would be clear, I think, operational benefits to al-Shabaab if that was the option taken. So where do I come down on this? My overall argument that I try and flesh out in the report is that I think the most sensible way forward is for US policy to start supporting a negotiated settlement to this war. But there's a bit of a two-step sort of dance required here. And I think the US needs to support two linked negotiated settlements. The first is between the federal government of Somalia and the regional federal member states. I think at heart, the fundamental core problem at the heart of Somalia's instability is a problem of governance. It's fundamentally because Somali's political elites do not agree on how to govern this country. And all the tensions and problems that result of that over the last sort of 2 decades in particular is the fundamental source of instability in Somalia. So the first thing to do is to engineer a genuine political deal and get political reconciliation between the federal government and the member states. That, for me, needs two things to happen. We need to finalise and clarify the outstanding details of federal governance, the constitution and the like, and electoral processes and all the things that are being argued about now. And we need a new comprehensive security strategy that actually has the buy-in of not just the federal government and the international partners, but genuinely has the buy-in of the federal member states as well. Now, if we could come to that sort of reconciled set of Somali authorities in that first deal, certainly I think the fight against al-Shabaab would be more promising. I think a united set of federal authorities and regional authorities could make better progress on building an effective national army, and things could generally go better on a number of levels. However, I still don't think a decisive military victory against al-Shabaab is on the cards. I don't envisage a type of scenario that we saw maybe in Sri Lanka with the defeat of the Tamil Tigers, for example, back in 2009. I think al-Shabaab is a quite resilient and different entity than that type of group. And so at that stage, I think, with the reconciled Somali authorities, the United States, in my opinion, should support a negotiated settlement to end the war. In that sense, obviously, the details of any negotiations would, of course, be left up to the conflict parties themselves to decide, and there's lots of questions that I point to in the report to sort of figure out. But it would mean the strategic function of US military action would be precisely to incentivize that outcome. It would be to incentivize al-Shabaab's leadership and hopefully, persuade other rank and file members of the organization that negotiation is the best way forward to end this, this conflict. So that hopefully is a reasonable overview of my report, and I'll hand back to Ahmed now.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you so much for that overview and taking us through the arguments that you've outlined in your paper so succinctly and so well. I shall turn very quickly to our first discussant and ask Abdi Ainti if he wouldn't mind coming in to give us his thoughts on the arguments in the paper and also more broadly on US policy in Somalia. Abdi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thanks for having me on this very important and timely panel. And I also appreciate Professor Williams' very excellent summary of his report, which I enjoyed reading, and I agree with him on the key conclusions he had made. What I would like to do is to organize my thoughts around in three parts. First, to put some historical context of the US engagement and policy in Somalia, and then discuss a little bit the current US policy from a Somali perspective, and then end with a way forward, again, touching on some of the points that Professor William had touched on. So very briefly on a historical context, so we're all on the same page. Over the past 3 decades, US policy towards Somalia was defined by two mutually reinforcing paradigms. One was containment policy, and the other was dual track policy, and they're very well discussed in Professor Williams' paper. These policies were precipitated by the events of Black Hawk Down, and following that episode, the posture in Washington was that Somalia's conflagration was too complex, too distant, very much unsolvable, and perhaps most importantly, lacking strategic value for the overall US foreign policy in the region. And with that in mind, a minimalist approach was crafted in the form of a containment policy. However, the 1998 bombings of US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania and the 9/11 events appended that paradigm and led to the introduction of dual track policy. The gist of that policy was to outsource counterterrorism efforts to local actors in Somalia, such as Somaliland, Puntland, and more perniciously to a phalanx of warlords who were controlling the rest of Somalia at that point in time. In 2006, an overreach by those local actors led to their stinging defeat in the hands of the Union of Islamic Courts, which of course included al-Shabaab. And the US was too embarrassed by this outcome, but once again, it sanctioned the 2007 intervention by Ethiopia, which further emboldened al-Shabaab. That's just a brief context to the discussion I'm about to make. The second part is to discuss what are the current US policies, again from a Somali perspective and based on Professor Williams' key points. First, I would say that it was, in fact, President Obama who had taken decisive steps with regards to Somalia by formally recognizing the federal government in 2013, meeting with the former President Hassan Sheikh at the White House, sending Secretary Kerry to Mogadishu, and appointing the first ambassador since 1991. All of these were very strong signals of a shift away from containment and dual track policies and a new dawn of a new era informed by new strategic interests. Chief among those interests were, of course, staving off China's ubiquitous foray into the region and continued cooperation on counterterrorism with the federal government and other actors as well. The appointment of a veteran diplomat, Ambassador Yamamoto, a couple of years ago was another important signal by Washington's growing interest in Somalia. And if you would recall, as Professor Williams discusses in detail in his paper, Ambassador Yamamoto presented a very articulate vision, which was forward-looking and very comprehensive in 4 points. Under him, he continued to play a key role on many aspects, including the ongoing debt relief, as well as humanitarian. I mean, the US remains to be the largest bilateral donor to Somalia on humanitarian and development aspects. However, when you look at the political and security arenas, the US policy is demonstrably incoherent and even timid at times. As the rift between the federal government and the federal member states deepened over power and resources in the past 3 years, the US was widely perceived as providing an unqualified support to the federal government's muscular and centralist engagement with federal member states. This internal crisis between the FGS and FMS has effectively undercut the war against al-Shabaab, worsened the overall humanitarian situation in the country, and in fact, it brought the country on the brink of renewed conflict. And aside from let me just say that also the security arrangements that were agreed in London in 2017 between the FGS and FMS were ignored by all sides before the ink had even dried. And aside from quiet diplomacy, the US hasn't exerted the required pressure on all sides to solve the outstanding political problems, without which cooperation on security among the federal member states and the federal government would never happen. Which is why, as Professor Williams said, the war against al-Shabaab has come to a standstill since 2006. When you look at the Somaliland-Somalia dialogue, for example, the US is sending mixed signals at the moment, with the mission in Somalia pursuing an ambitious reunification project and objective, while the National Security Council appears to be encouraging Somaliland's diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, as evidenced by a recent tweet. Meanwhile, neighboring countries and regional actors such as the Gulf countries continue to pursue very narrow geostrategic objectives that ultimately undermine the state-building agenda in Somalia. Regrettably, again, the US hasn't done much to stop this, and in fact, in some cases, the US is perceived to be uncritically endorsing some of the adventurism by some of the neighboring countries, such as the so-called regional integration championed by Ethiopia alongside Eritrea. Now, on the way forward, I'll say a few words. First, the current US policy in Somalia is simply not commensurate with that of the largest bilateral donor to Somalia, and certainly not the most important ally of Somalia. So if Washington desires to play a leading role in Somalia, not to lead from behind, I would say the US would need to decisively align its security priorities with Somalia's peace-building and state-building imperatives through the prism of national reconciliation and inclusive politics. And that would be done in two ways. First, the US would have to devote considerable political capital on mediating between the FGS and the FMS on outstanding structural issues relating to provisional constitution, federalism, resource sharing, and most urgently, the upcoming elections. And I think Professor Williams again discusses that in detail in his paper, which I fully agree. In this regard, I think the US deserves credit for publicly calling on an urgent dialogue on the national elections recently between the two sides, presumably after quiet diplomacy had failed. Fixing the political problem is prerequisite to fixing the security apparatuses in Somalia, which is a priority for the US. And this requires even-handedness and retail-level negotiations with all stakeholders in Somalia. Secondly, the US must whip other external actors into order. Some of these actors are frankly actively undermining the peace-building and state-building agenda and objectives that Somalia and its international partners have been pursuing for 20 years now. Acting like one among the many actors isn't going to yield peace dividends for Somalia or security for the US. So I would conclude that I would say, in addition to those points, I think it's vital for the US to also adopt a do no harm principle, both in its security and political interventions. As Professor Williams rightfully observes in his paper, too many civilians are being killed right now by US airstrikes since the rules of engagement were relaxed for such missions, even though the intended targets are obviously are al-Shabaab. So with that, I hand over back to you, Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdi, for your intervention and particularly salient points there around the necessity to fix the political process as a prerequisite to fixing other issues, security and others. Thank you very much. And I turn to Susan for your thoughts on the arguments in the paper as well as more broadly on US policy in Somalia. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Ahmed. It's a pleasure to be joining you and these esteemed panelists. It's a hard group to follow. So let me join Abdi in congratulating Paul on the excellent paper. And like him, I agree with so many of the things that Paul has laid out. I wanted to focus my comments around the political settlement, and maybe saying a little bit more about drawing out some aspects of that I think need to be looked at importantly. Secondly, to talk a little bit about the proposed negotiations and some thoughts about the sequencing, and indeed what a sequencing could potentially look like. And third, to end and pick up on what Abdi was talking about in relation to the broader trans-regional dynamics, and essentially set out the case that Somalia needs to be looked at in a broader trans-regional Red Sea arena, where the US will benefit most from calibrating its strategic priorities and understanding this interconnected security, political, economic, social, and historic space that often gets thought of as two different locations. And where, as we know, country strategies, engagements, diplomacy, and even security priorities are often thought of in a single country in borders. And in reality, we know that the situation is much more complicated than that. So on the political settlement aspect, I fully agree with what Paul sets out in the paper. I did want to just draw out specifically the notion of the economic aspects that need to be drawn out. And I assume that that's inherent in what Paul is talking about in terms of negotiating the power sharing arrangements, the relationship between the federal government and the federal member states. I do think it is worth saying explicitly that the economic aspects of that federalism structure, the economic responsibilities, the rights, who taxes, who's responsible for resources, what are the payment systems between, that is often the core of what's incredibly difficult and underlies much of the politics that play out. And I think that that's been clear in a lot of the ways that politics takes place in Somalia and anywhere else in the world. But sometimes, unless we are surrounded by economists, we sometimes forget that this is much of what drives the political negotiations that take place. So I think it would be interesting to draw that out a little bit further and think through where does the economic aspect sit in that conversation. The second part of the political settlement, I think Abdi alluded to the peace building components of the nation building, state building process that Somalia is undertaking. And I think for the United States, the framework and the compact that defined the partnership between the United States and Somalia, that was driven in part through the New Deal partnership at an earlier phase, and Abdi is much better position to talk about this than I am. But I think that that's an important innovation to a key part of the US-Somalia relationship. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is this increasing agreement around the notion of a prevention agenda, around the importance of fostering resilience, around the critical nature of the state-society relationship. And in the United States, the ongoing conversation and the adoption of the Global Fragility Act, which talks about the interconnection between the security, defense, the diplomacy, and the development, that encourages a preventive approach, not responding once there is a conflict, and that actually requires a strategy developed by the Department of State and reported against to Congress with this prevention frame in mind. I think we can see some of the important roots of this in Somalia, and I think that that's something that's a real credit to the government of Somalia, to civic actors in Somalia who are so deeply involved in shaping that, and I think started to redefine some of the ways that we think about international partnerships. So I wanted to draw that piece out. So this leads me to the recommendation about seeking negotiated agreements, and I fully agree that that's a necessary approach. I guess I would question a bit and hesitate whether the sequencing is quite so straightforward as starting with the federal member states and the federal government, and then moving to negotiation with al-Shabaab. It strikes me that there's a risk that we will think about these as two separate conflicts, when in fact, these are symptoms of a broader, consistent set of drivers of conflict in Somalia, of an aspiration and a demand for defining what the relationship is between defining what the state is and what the state does, defining what the responsibilities are, defining what society is, what societies look like, and how they relate to the government. And I think a yearning and an ongoing frustration that governments, whatever form and whatever level that takes, it still struggled to provide basic services to the people. And so I think there's an opportunity to think about this in a more holistic and interconnected way. I also think that there's a risk that if the federal member states and the federal government solidifies, cements, and in some ways locks in an agreement, it makes it much more difficult to leave space for other actors who may wish to play a political role, and to address some of these underlying grievances that relate directly to parts of the ongoing violence and conflict with al-Shabaab. So I guess I'd encourage maybe a more holistic view on that, an interconnected, multi-level, complex picture that I think everybody knows and appreciates, but I just draw it out. In that same notion, negotiations with al-Shabaab, I think, as Paul says in the report, there's been some interesting parallels in terms of what's happened in Afghanistan over the past couple of years. But I also would just underline that we often think about extremist groups or any conflict groups as monolithic. And I would just encourage that we need to better understand the structures of al-Shabaab. We need to better understand their interests, the hopes and the aspirations. What are the structures that are driven by business imperatives? What are the structures that are linked into criminal business networks? Those ones take an entirely different and fundamentally changed approach to negotiate with. Where are they ideologically driven? And so I think that people have recognized that the identities are incredibly fluid across. There are some people who have been affiliated with al-Shabaab, who may have assisted al-Shabaab, who have appreciated the services that al-Shabaab provides. And so really understanding where you can meet these groups and members of the groups and communities where al-Shabaab has been hosted, communities that have had to negotiate a relationship already, in a way that allows for a much more successful negotiation. And part of that is an articulation of what does a future vision look like for those communities. And part of that is a responsibility for the federal member states and the federal government. Part of it is also this negotiation with al-Shabaab. So I'll just finish with maybe a short comment on the regional dynamics. And I think we've been looking at the Red Sea arena and trying to understand and bring forward the ways that the engagement of Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, all the way around the Red Sea coastal area and even beyond the coast, how that's impacting on peace and security in the Horn of Africa. And I think Abdi mentioned the Somalia-Somaliland negotiations. I think that's an incredibly important arc. If we stretch it out a bit further, there's the evolving, maybe emerging relationship between Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea. There are the ongoing initiatives by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, looking at regional integration within the Horn and the Red Sea. There's the work that the AU High-Level Implementation Panel is looking at on this same question in partnership and in close contact with IGAD. There's this new Red Sea Security Council that's an initiative of Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And a lot of this has been driven by the observation of the number of ports that are being built along the coast, the strategic economic security interests that are playing into that, and the ways that can fundamentally undermine the nation and state building project. And so we've been making the argument that for the United States to be successful in its national security priorities, it needs to look at this space more holistically. And so I just encourage that as we're thinking about Somalia, situating it in that broader interconnected context is incredibly important. And I think COVID has reminded us of that in a really shocking sort of way, that the populations that move back and forth, the politics the money, and the risks of health dynamics really need to drive towards a slightly different view of how this region works. I'll hand it back over to you, Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Susan. They're fantastic points that you made there, and thank you for taking the time to, I think, unpick some of the areas on political settlements and then draw it out also to some of the regional dynamics and interconnections and your focus on the need for holistic responses. I will turn to our audience and start the question and answer session. Just a reminder to everybody that we would very much like for you to ask a question live by using the raise hand function in Zoom. You can submit questions also through Q&A, but please do in the first instance use the raise hand function if you're comfortable to do so, and I'll try and take some questions in groups of 3 for our speakers. Just a reminder to everyone that this meeting is fully on the record as well as we proceed. So we have a lot of questions, some familiar names there. I will start by taking one from, I think, Faiza Loyan. Faiza, if you would unmute yourself, please, and introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hello?
Faiza, can you hear us? Are you able to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Okay. By the way, I should clarify, I am not Faiza Loyan, I'm Ferdowsa Loyan, I'm her older sister.
Ah, Ferdowsa, my apologies. Please do introduce yourself.
No problem, that's why it took me long to unmute myself. I thought Faiza will say something. My question actually is for Professor William as well as Abdi and Susan, the discussants. And it's really related to the problem of governance. Professor William made a statement that Somali elites don't agree on how to govern Somalia. That's a very serious statement, and maybe if we could find some insight on why this is so, we might be able to find grassroots solutions for Somalia. The reason I'm not asking this question only to Abdi Ahente is that you all have different perspectives, and those perspectives will help all of us that today had the pleasure to listen to your presentations. And I would also like to thank you very much. This was very, very nice insight.
Thank you very much, Ferdowsa, and thank you for your question. Do you have an institution or organization you would like to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I introduced myself as Faiza Loyan since she's the famous sister. But I'm a policy analyst, senior policy analyst, and a senior policy advisor for economic development as well as socioeconomic issues for the federal government of Canada, and I'm a Somali Canadian.
Thank you very much, Ferdowsa. I'll take a couple more questions. If I could ask, please, Hussein Mursal to unmute himself and to introduce himself and ask a question.
My name is Dr. Hussein Mursal, and I am an independent consultant, currently working on lobbying for the legislation of child rights in Somalia and the adoption of inclusive anti-poverty and social protection policies. My question is also for all the 3 panels. And what I would like to know from you guys is how much influence can the current Somali government have in shaping the US policy in evolving towards the 3 scenarios Professor Williams have mentioned? And linking to that is who Somalia should bet on when it comes to the regional structures like the US, EU, IGAD, the Council, and so on, in order to ensure the evolution of Somalia towards stability within best interest of the regional stability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hussein. I'll take a third question. If Mary Harper would like to unmute herself and ask a question, introduce yourself, please, also.
Hello, everybody. It's Mary Harper here from the BBC. Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask something that both Susan and Ainte brought up about all these other foreign regional powers who are playing all sorts of games in Somalia, whether the US is the right power, I suppose, to try to take this on, or whether it has now become just one amongst many, and that it hasn't really got the influence to effectively try to prevent or at least alleviate some of the problems that are being caused by all these different actors pouring their hands into Somalia and pulling it in so many different directions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll stop there. There's quite a lot. Perhaps I could ask Paul to come in if there are any questions that do jump on you. I think the first question in particular was for everyone around Somali elites and really how them not agreeing on how to govern Somalia and whether how do we find answers to this question, or where do we look for answers to this question. But please do give your response to the questions that you think are most suited.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for a good question. So on the first one, yeah, I would see basically two layers of answering that question about where the disagreements come from. On one layer, I think this is a macro historical issue of the nature of the state in Somalia. You know, we've had the state from 1960-ish to 1991, and obviously some Somalis did much better out of that modern state power than others, and I think that's coloured their perceptions of what the role of a functioning, effective state will do. So I think one strand of disagreement is based on their experiences during that period of sort of statehood until the collapse in 1991. And the second then really goes back again to the civil war in the late 1980s and the collapse of the state at the end of it. I think there hasn't been true reconciliation across most of the political elites, really dating back to then. And the evidence I see for that is, as we talked about earlier, I see a lack of an ability to agree on the economic aspects of the settlement that Susan mentioned, and a lack of ability to agree on a finalised constitution, which is dealing with a whole host of tricky issues. But I think, although, of course, all constitutions deal with tricky issues, these are sort of a 2 to 3 year problem to deal with. These are not a 25 to 30 year problem. This is where vested political interests now are getting in the way of actually making a settlement. So that's why I see the sort of, when I say the governance and the disagreements about governance are the key issues, that's what I mean. It's that long-term stuff that is going to be really tricky to deal with, but has to be confronted head on. I think then to the second question about the leverage that the FGS has with the United States, I mean, quite a bit, obviously, right? Here, as I said, Somalia is not in the top tier of problems for the US administration very often. But the federal government is in a genuine partnership now, as Auntie mentioned, since 2013, the US-Somalia relationship has been one of a normal diplomatic relationship between states. So the federal government certainly has leverage. What I think is the problem sometimes is that the federal government, I think, overreaches and overplays the amount of power it has, certainly to dominate the regions. And I think the evidence that I would see is that maybe the federal government needs to sort of, I would say, recalibrate its expectations about its ability to dominate outcomes in the regions. If I do a basic sort of power analysis, and you look at military, economic, and political power, I don't see one preeminent power source in the form of the federal government dominating the rest of Somalia, Somaliland, and Puntland. I see a more decentralized set of 5 or 6 key players that can wield a lot of power. And so that's the key dynamic, I think, one of mutually accommodating interests. And that's where I think the United States needs to listen more attentively. Of course, it's then up to Somalia to decide who is the best partner in any dimension. for me, I think it does break down by sectors. There's not really one country, I think, that can support across all sectors. What the United States might be best at in terms of military support, Turkey might be much better at in terms of humanitarian and other forms of support, or the EU or whoever else. So I think there's a menu for choice there, and that would be obviously for the Somali authorities to debate. And then finally, just on the, from Mary's question about is the United States the right power to lead here, I want to be sort of clear about the argument I was trying to make in the paper. And actually, I don't think the United States should be out the front or a sort of public leading political force in Somalia at all. I think we're quite toxic for many Somalis, rightly or wrongly. What I was trying to get at is about how we calibrate US policy from sort of the Washington end, and what is our strategic goal from Washington's side of the spectrum here. And I think Washington really needs to reshape how it thinks about its objective away from military victory against al-Shabaab and towards political reconciliation between Somalia's competing political administrations. And so if it can do that, I think it would be in a more than useful place to usefully support those two negotiations that I mentioned. But I would only see the United States as playing a backseat and quite minimal role, certainly on the first one. And absolutely, definitely on an agreement with al-Shabaab. The United States shouldn't be up front and center in any of this, in my opinion. This needs to be handled, but it should still support that process, because I think it's still better than all the alternative options. I just don't think the status quo is producing stability and peace in Somalia, and I don't think really rapid disengagement is also the way to go. So I think negotiations is where I would put our efforts.
Thank you very much. Abdi, if I might turn to you, could I ask you, instead of perhaps focusing on all of the questions, maybe specifically to hone in on the external actors question? I know Susan touched upon it in her remarks, so it'd be nice to hear from you about this, and how Somalia can really assert its own interests within this regional picture that we talk about in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. And particularly given some of the interventions in Somalia we've seen by Gulf actors over recent years.
Yeah, thanks, Ahmed. Look, I very much echo what Professor Williams said on this. I would only say that with respect to the external actors, I'm of the school of thought that always avoids to externalize our problems in Somalia. They are primarily our problems in Somalia. We need to sort them out, and that's why we emphasize political reconciliation among Somali stakeholders as a primary vehicle for solving the fundamental issues facing our governance issues. However, I think one cannot turn a blind eye to what is now increasingly a pernicious intervention by our neighbors as well as some regional actors who, as I said, really are undermining the state building and peace building objectives for very narrow geostrategic objectives. How to handle that is a tricky issue because they are essentially latching on their friends and allies within Somalia, and that's why you have essentially that's where their success lies on. I mean, one actor is friends with one member state or the federal government and vis-a-vis, right? So it's a complex process that's very much weaved into our political discourse. The reason why I think in response to Mary's question, the US is uniquely positioned to play an important role there is, number one, the US is the only country, I believe, that has the political influence to essentially organize, if you will, for lack of a better word, or whip them to order. No other country that I can think of that has that, number one. Number two, in large part, again, I'm generalizing here, the US is largely viewed as probably one of the most impartial countries in Somalia, as opposed to as comparing to pretty much most other countries, if you will. So that, I think, also gives the US a lot of credibility to lead on that. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, I think the US had invested in Somalia much more than any other country, again, bilaterally over the last 20 years. So it has the most to lose, both in security terms and in political terms as well. And if you now think of it as the geostrategic interest of the US, where you see China growing its interest in Somalia, and the US is very much mortified about that. I think the US has everything to lose there. So I would say, yes, the US is the only country. It's imperfect. However, what we have seen in the last few years is that the US playing an actor like any other actor in Somalia, and essentially allowing neighboring countries and others to do what is essentially undermining peace building and state building objective. And I think that is a dangerous course for our country, and it is increasing. We're not Libya yet. However, we have all the ingredients of Libya. A proxy war is already underway inside Somalia, whether we like it or not. And that needs to be, I think, stemmed from this point on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Susan, turning to you, if I could ask you to maybe comment on that question around the leverage that the federal government or Somali actors and policymakers have within the US, and to try and shape and perhaps shift US policy towards the country.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky question. I think you know, there was another question that I think was a bit related about where should Somali leaders put their bets in terms of the best partner, and I would say you never want to bet on one horse, right? You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, whatever metaphor we want to use, and I think that's true in terms of thinking about the geopolitical space. I agree with Abdi that the U.S. has a role and an authority, and in many ways because of that a responsibility to try to ensure that the rift that exists in the Gulf doesn't mirror and complicate and undermine the hard work that's taking place and the U.S. priorities in Somalia. I think in terms of identifying the leverage points and the influence, you know, I think there's the United States has various branches of government. I think that Congress has long been an important area of engagement. Africa has consistently been an area of priority on a bipartisan basis. So whether you have a Republican or a Democratic administration or Congress. And I think that Congress remains an incredibly important area of engagement. I think this is true for a couple of reasons, but not least of which because there is a significant Somali American community, and there are constituents who have loud and influential voices. There are representatives that have ties to Somalia, and I think in the politics of Washington that's incredibly important because there's both the international national security interest, and then there are the domestic political considerations. Within the administration, I think it's a complicated picture, and like Somalia, the United States is going into an election year in a very complicated environment. My experience is that, if I were advising the ambassador in Washington, D.C., or the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I'd encourage them to be fostering the strongest relationships possible with the Department of State, with USAID, with Treasury, with the Department of Agriculture, and with the National Security Council. And so I think we've seen that policy tends to be a bit more fragmented than it has been in the past, and certainly having the conversations with the Department of Defense and with US AFRICOM that's deeply engaged in Somalia, and encouraging where there are champions, because I think we do hear clearly from our colleagues in the Department of Defense a recognition that it's not just the defense tool that will bring stabilization and peace and security and state building to Somalia. They recognize that there's a fundamental need on the diplomatic front. And I would strongly encourage that Somali government representatives are talking to their counterparts in the Africa bureaus and to folks who are working on Near East affairs, because this is such a complicated and interconnected system, and to request that explicitly in their engagements with the US government.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'll turn to another round of questions and take again a group of three. We have plenty of hands up. If I could ask, please, Jock, please to unmute yourself, introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this incredibly informative and engaging presentation by William and the respondents. My question is really on something that I have not heard, which is perhaps Abdi hinted to it regarding this being the onus being on the Somalis. And time again, people have said that the problems of Somalia are really more to do with the international conversions on Somalia rather than being just the Somali issue. And that have we considered possibilities of hands-off Somalia as an attempt? Because it's been 3 decades of the same interventions from within Africa and from the Gulf countries and from the global north, and the spiral downward continues. So what are some of the likely possibilities that hands-off Somalia might be something that can be considered? Thank you.
Thank you, Jok. And if you could please introduce yourself for everyone, that would be great.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm Jok Madud Jok. I'm with the SET Institute, which is a policy research center in South Sudan, and with Syracuse University in upstate New York.
Thank you. I'll take a second question from Jens Peter Durbach. Please do unmute yourself, introduce yourself, Jens Peter, and ask your question.
Thank you so much. I'm Jens Peter. I'm a Chief Governance Advisor with the Danish Embassy Somalia Program. Strikes me with probably too many governance advisors around it, because I think we all agree on the solutions, not just Abdi Ainti and I who talk about this all the time. But my question is, I want to get a little bit more detail on how to make option 2 a scenario 2 or Paul's scenario 2, get it to materialize. I mean, all the conferences, all the frameworks, that's exactly what they've been about. From London 2012, London 2017, all the Somali Partnership Fora, basically, you know, reconciliation, state building, and at least in those fora, everybody would agree that, sorry, Susan, you had a slight disagreement with that, but nevertheless, that you need reconciliation internally, and thereafter also, basically, al-Shabaab is a function of the tensions within the elite. So in a sense, that's what we've all been working about or towards. So my question, I guess, is what could or should be the role of the US in driving a strong enough like-minded international community coalition, and how likely is it they would do it? I mean, the very brief background, apart from saying this is what we claim we've all been working towards, in my 5 years in and on Somalia, I think the actual fact is that the focus has been on a constant string of very tactical process indicators. I mean, London 2017 has already been mentioned. In the end, it was basically, you know, will each of these levels have a National Security Council, and how many meetings will they have? A lot of the benchmarks for debt relief, important as it was in its own right, was extremely downstream, I dare say. On politics, we are as uncoordinated as ever, and I think literally in these hours that's playing out, including between, I think, 2 Security Council member states. So the question is, I think maybe to Susan and Paul, what could and would the US do, and what should they do, and maybe to Abdi, you know, what is the impact of this lack of coordination or all these different positions, even from the kind of Western like-minded on Somalia? Thank you very much. Great points, everybody.
Thank you very much. I'll take a final question. If Justina Dillon would like to unmute and please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Can you hear me? Okay, very good. Hi, thank you. Professor Justina Dillon. I currently teach in Toronto, but formerly worked in NATO on Somali issues and have done some work in the US and think tanks. My question is really focused and specific. So as I mentioned, as I wrote it in the Q&A, the economic aspect, that's always interested me. I've also worked in Afghanistan, Sudan, Iraq, and different other places. So when I look at the economic factor in terms of how different groups, whether they are legitimate, elected, governmental powers, groups vying for power, different interest groups, their, let's say, survival, although it depends on political buy-in, it definitely needs economic support. So I just wanted a little more information and for you to flesh that out, because I think Susan mentioned it a couple of times. I think it's integral. So I referred in my question to a book called Jihad and Company, written by a colleague of mine, Dr. Aisha Ahmed, which actually talks about and does some work on al-Shabaab and their economic interests. So just wanted to hear more about it. My other interest in Somalia sparked the economic questions, had to do with piracy and how that kind of led to many social issues, political issues, but also economic desires. So just wanted some information on that and for you to flesh it out. By the way, congratulations, excellent paper. And Abdi, your comments are right on point. I'm very impressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justina. Professor, thank you for your questions. Okay, I'll turn over back to our speakers and perhaps to Paul first. If you'd like to come in on any of those questions, and maybe you'd like to attempt to try the question of hands off. Should we leave it to Somali actors to resolve some of those issues that you have been raising in your paper, particularly with regards to the need for dual political settlements?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, actually, I think the first couple of questions are linked precisely by that issue. So if I'll just answer Jock and Jens Peter's questions, because it does hinge on this willingness, I think, of the United States to potentially disengage militarily from Somalia. And this goes to I think the sources of leverage over the federal government. On Jock's question, should there be a hands-off Somalia approach? I mean, I think there's two streams of that argument. One is people that point to the Somaliland experience, and they say that because the Somaliland experience was basically, not driven by international aid, international engagement, etc., and the relatively stable outcome we've seen, can this be replicated in some way in other parts of Somalia? And the second part of it stems from a very different type, and that's the Trump administration's change of US foreign policy direction. Under the 2018 National Defense Strategy, where strategic competition between the great powers is key, Africa in general is, I think, diminished in United States foreign policy, and it wasn't really very high in the first place. And Somalia in particular will be therefore downgraded as well. And I think you could see a willingness to disengage in sort of Trump administration language because Somalia shouldn't be prioritized in an era of great power competition. Now, if it's on the edge with the Red Sea area that Susan talked about, if it's on the edge of an important zone, that's a slightly different question. But the other reason for thinking that is there's a growing, I think, voice or set of voices in the US debate about foreign policy, which is really pushing sort of retrenchment, if you like, or a more restrained approach to US foreign policy. And again, people are raising questions. Why are we spending so much money and are we so militarily engaged in Somalia compared to when we should be spending and fixing problems back home? So I think it's part of this domestic set of voices. Why do we, or that really has to justify US military activity in Somalia? And I think those things are becoming harder and harder to justify if the federal government doesn't make progress. And so I'm in my own experience, I'm seeing a lot more US government officials, but also just members of the public, questioning why we should keep adopting the same policy. When I've said, again, we're at year 14 in the war against al-Shabaab. And so this gets to Jens Peter's point about how likely is it to happen. I think it's really only likely to happen if the US gets really serious about using its leverage that it has over the federal government. And this is not going to look pretty diplomatically. This is going to get ugly, I think, potentially. But the logic behind it is that the status quo has just not worked. It's not delivered an effective Somali set of security forces. It's not defeated al-Shabaab or even really degraded them. I think if I look at the last 4 years of this war, al-Shabaab is holding its own really well. And whether al-Shabaab would even want to come to the negotiation table with the Somali federal government is something that we need to consider as well. That's certainly not a guaranteed option. What are the sources of leverage? The big one economically for me is debt relief. The United States holds about a quarter of all Somali debt relief payments and how those may flow through. Secondly, I think the federal government really values US airstrikes from a tactical point of view. It's no coincidence, in my opinion, that al-Shabaab has not turned over an AMISOM forward operating base since early 2017 when the airstrikes ramped up. The ability to muster those types of attacks has been diminished, I think, by the US more sort of aggressive approach on airstrikes. And third source of leverage is DANAB and the military training. So the advanced infantry units that the Americans have trained, equipped, mentored and paid for. They are clearly the most effective part of the Somali security forces on the ground in terms of offensive operations. And so for all three of those things, I think to make option 2 more likely, the United States has to get really serious about pulling on those points of leverage and saying to the federal government, as I mentioned before, you can't expect to dominate the regions. And no amount of sort of parachuting in your preferred politicians or what have you is really going to fix the underlying problem. This needs to be a compromise amongst 5 or 6 centers of power in Somalia. And so that's my sort of logic behind advocating that.
Thank you very much, Paul. Susan, if I could turn to you next. Are there any questions there that you in particular would want to come in on? Yes.
I was hoping you were going to turn to Abdi first.
I wanted to switch it up.
Because he has probably much more wisdom on these things. I guess I would maybe just make a comment that maybe speaks to some of the various questions. I think the notion of negotiated settlements requires really considerable diplomatic engagement. And I'm not suggesting that the US should be at the center of that. Even orchestrating the type of support that would be required, marshaling the other regional actors with whom the US has strong relationships. I think just it takes a real diplomatic strategy. It takes a number of people working together to move that forward. It takes consistent interest and it takes high-level engagement. And I think that before, there's the question of leverage. And there's a question of sort of ripeness, like is there a moment where the various parties want to come to the table to negotiate? And that's something that we can assess, but it's really in the eyes of the beholders, right? It's not for us to say is it ripe or not. It's whether the parties feel that the moment is ripe or not. And there are things that external actors can do to help to ripen, but that has to be done in a very careful manner. And so I just say that, I think that people have recognized that, the US has a strong ambassador who's there, who knows the country, who's working closely with partners in the EU. And we know that from other negotiation processes, it really does require coordination and consistent attention and the ability to know when to step in to be a helpful convener in good offices and when to step back and be a useful mirror and be a good partner in talking things through and thinking a way forward. And when it's useful to push a lever, and when it's really risky. I hear what Paul is saying. I worry that dangling that type of leverage also puts the government, the federal government, in a really, really precarious situation. It also, I think, risks the government being encouraged to look to other partners because there are a range of other partners who would like to make themselves the preferred partners to many countries in the Horn of Africa and around the world. And I don't know that the US administration overall is fully calibrating and applying some of the logic of its own policy. If the policy is to prevent this deep fear, as Abdi said, of China's role, then that you would think would actually enhance the argument that the US should remain engaged in a very meaningful way in Somalia and in the Horn and in other parts of Africa.
Thank you very much, Susan. And turn to you, Abdi, as well, if perhaps you would like to tackle Jock's first question there around whether or not Somalia should be going it alone and trying to change the narrative. And also, I think we haven't touched on really on the final question related to, I guess, economic interests and what factor they play in terms of any settlements that might be reached.
Yeah. So on Jack's first question, look, many Somalis would welcome the notion of leaving it to the Somalis to sort it out. And in fact, I mean, I think here it's important to remind ourselves that a vast majority of the country is still just run by Somalis with absolutely no AMISOM or other foreign involvements at all. We often think about Mogadishu as the center of the problem, but when you look at Somaliland and Puntland and other parts of the country that are just doing really relatively well, I think that there is an example to be looked at. Now, in terms of though, I think the central question of Jok is a question of reconciliation. And, from where I stand, I do think that continues to be a central issue that needs to be achieved. And it's not a quick fix at all. I don't think it's a 3 to 5 year proposition. I think it's more of a 2 to 3 decade proposition, to be honest with you. And we have to be prepared for the long haul. And to that point, I would add that, in fact, in the last 20 years, we made tremendous progress in this regard, despite what looks like a very bleak picture. Let's remember where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when the transitional national government existed only in name. And today we have I would say, a relatively weak but a functioning government, and so on and so forth. So it's not all as bad as one it seems. I do want, though, to address the point of Paul Williams' proposition of a dialogue between al-Shabaab and the federal government of Somalia. Look, myself and a number of other people have been saying that now for 10 years. In fact, we published an article 10 years ago in the Foreign Affairs magazine to that very point. However, I think the environment has to be conducive for that to happen. At this point in time, I'm afraid that that's simply, the environment is not ready. Al-Shabaab has the upper hand. They're essentially, as Professor Williams says, holding their ground. The war came to a standstill since 2016. They have absolutely no incentive to engage in a political dialogue. And if they were, they would engage it from a point of strength. And you wouldn't want that to be the case. You would want to put them in a position where they are considerably much weaker than they are right now, and then possibly open those doors. Now, of course, it didn't help that in the last few years, especially with what happened in Baidoa in December 2018 with the arrest of Mukhtar Robo, a former leader of al-Shabaab, who was willing to engage in the political process, it does not help because it sends the wrong signal to the very few people in al-Shabaab leadership who might be willing to engage in a dialogue at this point in time. So I think that point has to be clear. Then very quickly on what Jan Peter said about coordination or lack of coordination and the impact that has on Somalia in general. Look, I've had the front row seat on that as the Minister of International Cooperation and dealt with competing interests of international interests and tried to bring them onto a common vision with the National Development Plan. But before that, we even had the deal. The new deal, which had very clearly well-defined objectives. It's not always easy, and countries tend to pursue a narrow strategic objective over a sort of a multilateral objective, and that's what I was describing earlier on. That's actually one of the central challenges we have in Somalia. Even with AMISOM, I mean, you have frontline states, Ethiopia, Kenya, and others who are involved in AMISOM, who are, one day pursuing a peace building and objective, and another day pursuing a buffer zone objective, and that is the reality we are confronting with, and that needs to be really re-looked at. Again, Professor Williams wrote an entire book on that. One can look into that. And then finally, on the question of economics and how this fits into all of this, there is no doubt that economic plays a central role in the conflict in Somalia. The conflict we see right now between the federal government and the member states revolves around resource sharing, among others. It also revolves around the conflict between al-Shabaab and the federal government. Really is now more than anything else about resources. A number of studies have shown that al-Shabaab are raising considerable amount of revenue from government-controlled territory, including Mogadishu, and they see the status quo as the one that actually works to their advantage. So yes, it plays part of it. And the sad part is that in that dichotomy, the federal government is actually the weakest link, because it's only able to raise about $400 million a year, barely, mainly from Mogadishu alone, with a budget of $1.something billion for next year. So you have a serious economic problem that is impacting the country. The debt relief certainly helped to alleviate some of that suffering, and we see the windfall now coming into Somalia, but I think it would need to be sustained because we're not there yet. We're not on the finishing line when it comes to the debt relief. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Abdi, and thank you all very much for your insights and your comments. I'm afraid we're going to need to leave it there. So my apologies to all of our participants who have been patiently waiting with their hands virtually raised to ask a question. I'd like to take the opportunity again to thank Professor Paul Williams for his time and for our discussants for kindly joining us, Abdi Ainti and Susan Stegant today, and sharing their insights and expertise of many decades on Somalia. I'd also like to remind everybody with us that the paper, Paul's paper, research paper, is available on the Chatham House website, as well as on the Africa Program's Twitter handle, so you can look there to download the paper and to read further if you haven't already. Many thanks to you all for joining us, those participating through Zoom, those joining us through Facebook Live, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.